On December 5th, 1945, 14 experienced pilots took off from Fort Lauderdale, Florida. The men, aboard 5 U.S. Navy Grumman TBM Avenger torpedo bombers, were participating in a combat and navigation training exercise. After flying into a heavy cloud cover, the lieutenant in charge of the operation reported that his compasses were malfunctioning. He warned the other pilots that he was disoriented, but they kept flying further away from shore and over the Atlantic. Suddenly, no further radio transmissions were received back at base. The group of bombers, collectively known as Flight 19, were never heard from again. A PBM Mariner flying boat sent out to search for the squadron also went missing. What happened to all 6 aircraft has led to wide speculation. The most famous theory is that Flight 19 disappeared within the Bermuda Triangle, an area in the Atlantic Ocean where dozens of airplanes are believed to have been lost. The fact remains that decades later, no trace has been found of Flight 19 or the PBM Mariner crew after their disappearance. Without evidence of the wreckage or the crewman's fate, it's impossible to know what actually happened to them. December 5th, 1945 was a warm day with average weather conditions, appropriate for the training exercises planned for the afternoon. 14 pilots were gathered at the Naval Air Station in Fort Lauderdale in Florida to participate in an overwater navigation training flight. The flight leader was Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor, an experienced pilot with almost 2,500 flying hours. A veteran of World War II, Taylor had ample experience flying torpedo bombers. But witnesses say he arrived late to the pre-exercise briefing and had asked to be excused from the mission. According to the witnesses, Taylor stated, quote, "I just don't want to take this one out." The rest of the crew wasn't as experienced as Taylor, but they were no amateurs. Most of them had accumulated over 300 hours in the air and had to complete just one more practice before graduation. Training Squadron Flight 19 consisted of 5 U.S. Navy Grumman TBM Avenger torpedo bombers, with 3 pilots in 4 planes and 2 pilots in another. This last plane was 1 crewman short. The airman in question, Corporal Alan Costner, had, quote, asked to be excused from the exercise. Flight 19 was to fly out over the water to Hen and Chicken Shoals and carry out a low-level bombing practice. Then they were to overfly the Grand Bahama Island, turn left, and return to Fort Lauderdale. Pre-flight checks discovered that the planes were missing clocks, but this wasn't relevant as pilots were expected to have their own watches. The torpedo bombers were reported in good condition, and their fuel tanks were full. The squadron was scheduled to take off at 13:45 hours, but the lateness of Lieutenant Taylor delayed it by 25 minutes. The initial part of the exercise went by successfully. The bombers dropped their dummy bombs, and by 1500 hours, the last plane was given permission to drop the final bomb. 40 minutes later, things started going off course. The weather began to change, and Flight 19 went through a heavy cloud cover. Near the Florida coast, Lieutenant Robert F. Cox was getting a group ready for the same mission. Suddenly, he received a radio transmission from E.J. Powers, one of the pilots of Flight 19. An unidentified crew member with Cox asked for Powers' compass reading. Powers replied, quote, "I don't know where we are. We must have got lost after that last turn." Cox contacted the air station, and together they reached out to Taylor to find out if the group required assistance. Sounding anxious, the lieutenant explained they were probably overflying the Florida Keys, although he wasn't exactly sure of their location. He said, quote, "Both my compasses are out, and I'm trying to find Fort Lauderdale, Florida." Base operators couldn't pick up the IFF, a radio-based identification system designed for command and control. When asked if his plane was equipped with the IFF, Taylor gave no immediate response. The position of Flight 19 couldn't be located. Taylor was told to turn off his transmitter used for air traffic control, but did not acknowledge the order. When asked to switch to the search and rescue frequency, he replied, quote, "I cannot switch frequencies. I must keep my planes intact. The protocol for pilots lost in the Atlantic dictated that they turn the plane's port wing towards the setting sun and fly west until they reach the mainland. Base operators also advised turning west. But Taylor thought the squadron was in the Gulf of Mexico and decided to lead the squadron northeast for 10 minutes. His decision is believed to have led the group further into the sea. One of the pilots exclaimed over the radio, quote, "Damn it, if we could just fly west, we would get home. Head west, damn it." Past 5 p.m., the lieutenant finally accepted to turn west until they reached land or ran out of gas. By then, it was believed that the squadron was over 230 miles east of the Florida Peninsula. But half an hour later, Taylor returned to his idea that they were flying over the Gulf of Mexico and hadn't flown east far enough to reach the landmass. He then announced that they would turn east again, even though the group's position had been triangulated north of the Bahamas. As the planes went farther out over the sea, radio transmissions became faint. As the evening progressed, the weather also got worse. The fuel must have gotten dangerously low, and Taylor was last heard saying, quote, "All planes close up tight. We'll have to ditch unless landfall. When the first plane drops below 10 gallons, we all go down together." After that, nothing but a buzz of static could be heard from Flight 19. Airbases, aircraft, and merchant ships were promptly alerted that Flight 19 had gotten lost. At 7:27 p.m., the Naval Air Station of Banana River in Melbourne, Florida, sent out 2 PBM Mariner flying boats with rescue equipment. 3 minutes after takeoff, one of the Mariners, with 13 crew on board, sent a routine radio message. Then, it was never seen or heard from again. The civilian tanker SS Gaines Mills reported seeing an airplane falling after an explosion. The ship searched for survivors in the middle of an oil slick, but the worsening weather and the lack of daylight prevented any rescue. Flying boats were prone to catching fire, which earned them the nickname Flying Gas Tanks. It's believed the Mariner went up in flames, but none of its wreckage has been found. The next morning, one of the most extensive air and sea searches in history began. The Navy and the Coast Guard sent 248 planes and 18 surface craft into a search and rescue mission covering 200,000 square miles of the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico. For the next 3 days, ships and planes scoured Florida's coast, but found no trace of Flight 19 or the PBM Mariner. Many believe the 5 torpedo bombers ran out of fuel and crashed into the sea east of Daytona Beach. Lieutenant Dave White, senior flight instructor, aided in the search missions. But he stated that crashing into the sea at high speed is like hitting a brick wall, which highly decreased the possibility of survival. Even if any of the pilots had managed to survive, the bad weather made any rescue impossible. However, pilots and the general public alike are still mystified by how no wreckage has ever been found. A few months after the incident, the Navy published a 500-page investigation. It concluded that Flight 19 had flown over the Bahamas as expected, and that Taylor had led the group northeast over the Atlantic. The other pilots must have known he was making a mistake, and likely discussed this with Taylor to persuade him to turn east. However, none of them broke formation, probably due to military discipline. The report found Taylor, quote, guilty of mental aberration, even when it admitted that his compasses had failed. It suggested that the lieutenant had confused Abaco Island in the northern Bahamas with the Key West Islands. Fixated with the idea that they were in the Gulf of Mexico, Taylor led the group out to sea, past the bomber's fuel endurance. When the squadron's leader finally decided to turn west, the broken compass actually led him northwest, parallel to Florida. Still, had he kept his path, the group might have reached the landmass eventually. In light of the report, Catherine Taylor, the lieutenant's mother, launched her own investigation. She claimed her son couldn't be found guilty of the incident since no evidence had been uncovered, and no one knew what actually happened to the group. She eventually managed to get the Board of Correction for Naval Records to amend the cause of the incident to unknown. At least officially, Taylor was exonerated from any responsibility in the loss of life and naval aircraft. Despite the report, the Navy couldn't explain why Taylor became so disoriented, or why he didn't want to lead the practice in the first place. It's also unexplained why the other pilots didn't switch to the search and rescue frequency, or why they didn't turn on the receivers, as instructed by base operators. Flight 19 was later nicknamed the Lost Patrol, and its disappearance remains one of the greatest mysteries in aviation history. Several books published after the incident claimed that Flight 19 disappeared in the Bermuda Triangle, consisting of 500,000 square miles of ocean off Florida's southeastern tip. Legend has it that compasses turned erratic in the area, and dozens of ships and planes had disappeared there. The story became so popular that it even made it to Steven Spielberg's movie, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, where the crew of Flight 19 is seen being abducted by a UFO. In 1991, Marine engineer Graham Hawk led a treasure hunting expedition off the coast of Florida. There, he found the wreckage of 5 airplanes, which he thought to be Flight 19. But one of their tail numbers showed the aircraft actually belonged to a flight that got lost at sea 2 years before the Lost Patrol. In 2012, Hawk said he and the Pentagon hadn't been interested in pursuing that research. And despite any conclusive evidence, Hawk believes he found the missing squadron. Through the decades, many other wrecked airplanes have also been found and thought to be Flight 19. But officially, so far, the Lost Patrol still remains a mystery.